have replayed that moment 10,000 times. Not the verdict, not the confrontation, not even my mother's note, folded inside an old cookbook like a letter meant to survive the end of the world. I replay the judge's face. Was a composed man by all accounts, 31 years on the bench. He had heard confessions, witnessed breakdowns, presided over cases that would curl your hair just reading the transcripts. Nothing rattled him. Everyone in that county knew it. But when he pulled a yellowed envelope from an archive box that had been sealed for over 2 decades, and when his eyes moved slowly across the first page, something shifted in his expression. Something that had no business appearing on the face of a man like that. He set his glasses down. He read the page again. And then he whispered 2 words so quietly that the people in the back row had to ask each other what he said. My God. The courtroom didn't erupt. That's what I remember most. There was no gasp, no murmur, no dramatic wave of reaction. There was simply silence. The kind of silence that only happens when an entire room of people simultaneously stops breathing. My father's attorney, Charles Whitmore, the most polished legal mind in 3 counties, went the color of old chalk. My father's smile disappeared. And I, Daniel Mercer, 62 years old, a mechanic who had spent his life building things with his own 2 hands, sat very still and thought. She knew. All along she knew. But to understand what that moment meant, I have to take you back to the beginning. Not to the courtroom, not even to the lawsuit. I have to take you back to a town outside Columbus, Ohio, to a family that looked one way from the outside and functioned very differently within its walls, and to a boy who spent most of his childhood trying to earn something that should never require earning. People sometimes ask me how I found the strength to keep going. The honest answer is that strength had very little to do with it. Strength is something you summon when you have a choice. What I had was something more like stubbornness, the kind that grows slowly in a person who spends decades being told, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that their version of events doesn't count. By the time the lawsuit arrived, the stubbornness had been there so long it had become structural, part of the foundation. But there's something else, too, something I didn't fully understand until everything was over. I kept going because of my mother. Not because of what she left me in that courthouse archive, because of who she was during her life, because I had watched her navigate a marriage and a family and a set of circumstances that were frequently unjust, and I had watched her do it with a kind of dignity that didn't require anyone else's permission or acknowledgement. She wasn't waiting to be validated. She simply continued to know what she knew and to act accordingly. I think that's what she was teaching me, all those Saturdays at the hospital. All those conversations about old memories and maple trees and what happens after death. She was showing me, without ever quite saying it, that the truth about a thing has value independent of whether anyone is currently listening to it. And that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is simply hold on to it until the moment it's needed. I tried to be worthy of that lesson. I didn't always succeed. There were nights in that long year when I was so tired and so alone that I thought about all the people who had told me to let it go, and I thought maybe they had been right. Not because the cause wasn't worth fighting for, because I was just a mechanic from a small town in Ohio, and there is a very particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting a battle in a system that was not designed for people like me. But then I would think about her hand in mine. And I would get up the next morning. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was the oldest of 3 children. Below me came my brother, Nathan, 2 years younger, and my sister, Carol, who arrived 4 years after him. We grew up in a modest house that gradually became a large house, because my father, Warren Mercer, was a builder in every sense of the word. He started his own construction company before I was born. By the time I was 10, it employed 40 people. By the time I was 20, it was a regional force. He was not a cruel man in the way movies portray cruel men. He never raised his fist. He rarely even raised his voice. His particular talent was something far more effective than cruelty. He was an architect of worth. He decided, quietly and consistently, how much each person in his life deserved, and he communicated that decision not through words, but through actions so small and so steady that you couldn't point to any single one of them without feeling like you were being unreasonable. Nathan brought home a C in mathematics. My father drove him to a steakhouse and told the waitress T was his son's birthday, so they'd bring a free dessert. I brought home straight A's for an entire year. My father looked at my report card for roughly 4 seconds, set it on the kitchen table, and said, "Good." That was the architecture of my childhood. Not brutality, just measurement. And somehow, being quietly measured and found insufficient is its own kind of wound. It doesn't bleed in ways people can see, but it goes very deep. My mother, Eleanor, was the counterweight to all of it. She was a woman of extraordinary patience and almost architectural grace. She never argued with my father, not openly, but she had her own quiet forms of resistance. She would make my favorite dinner on the nights I seemed low. She would find me in the garage where I'd retreat to think, and she'd sit with me without requiring conversation. She had a gift for presence that I have never found in anyone else. She used to say, "Don't let other people's measurements become your own." I tried. I really did try. After high school, while Nathan walked into a management position at my father's company, I took a job at a service station. I learned to fix engines. I found something deeply satisfying about machines. They were honest. A part was either working or it wasn't. There was no favoritism inside a carburetor. I married a woman named Patricia when I was 26. She was a schoolteacher. She was sensible and warm, and she had a quality I've always admired: the ability to tell the truth with kindness rather than with it as a weapon. We built a life that was never grand but always solid. A house we paid off slowly. 2 children we raised with care. A life I was proud of, even when pride had to be self-generated rather than handed to me. I made peace with my family situation the way most people make peace with things that can't be changed. Compartmentalization. Acceptance. The slow, dignified work of deciding that someone else's opinion of your worth is not the final word on the subject. Then my mother became ill. She was diagnosed at 74. The cancer moved through her methodically, the way a fire moves through a building that has been waiting to burn. During her final 18 months, I drove to see her every Saturday without exception. My sister Carol lived 3 states away. Nathan was perpetually busy with the company. My father would appear, stay a polite hour, and leave. So it was mostly just us. We talked about everything and nothing. Old family stories, the garden she'd kept for 40 years, what she thought happened after death, whether certain regrets were worth carrying or better set down. She was preparing for the end with the same quiet competence she had brought to everything else in her life. 3 weeks before she died, she held my hand for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not sadness exactly, something more careful than sadness. She said, "One day the truth is going to matter, Daniel. When it does, don't be afraid of it." I asked her what she meant. She smiled. She changed the subject. She asked me whether I thought the maple tree in the backyard had another 10 years in it. She was gone before the first snow of that November. The funeral was well attended. My father wore a dark suit and received condolences with the practiced composure of a man who had always known how to perform dignity. Afterward, I noticed him in a long, quiet conversation with Charles Whitmore. They stood slightly apart from the rest of the gathering. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't grief. I filed it away. I had no reason to think anything of it at the time. Whitmore had been the family's attorney for over 20 years. Business conversations happened. I had other things on my mind. I would think about that conversation quite a lot, much later. The letters began arriving about 4 months after she was buried. At first, they seemed like routine estate correspondence. Notifications, updates, standard documentation. Patricia and I reviewed them together at the kitchen table, the way we handled everything. She was better with paperwork than I was. She had a teacher's eye for the detail that doesn't quite fit. It was Patricia who flagged it first. "Daniel," she said one evening, pushing a document across the table. "Look at this date." I looked, then I looked again. A property that had been held in a family trust for nearly 2 decades had been transferred out of that trust approximately 6 weeks after my mother's death. The paperwork was technically proper. The signatures were in place, but the timing was arresting. We started pulling other documents. The more we looked, the stranger the picture became. Assets that had been listed under joint trust provisions were now attributed to entities I didn't recognize. Corporate structures had appeared with names I'd never heard. Trust amendments had been filed in the months surrounding my mother's passing. And I, the eldest child, the eldest member of the family, had apparently been removed from the primary family trust entirely. I called my father. He didn't answer. I called again. On the third attempt, he picked up. Dad, I'm looking at a trust document, and it says I've been removed. This has to be an error. A pause. It's not an error. I thought I had misheard him. What? Your mother isn't here to manage things anymore. His voice was calm, absolutely calm. Decisions have been made. I'm your son, I said. I remember exactly how those 3 words felt leaving my mouth. Not angry, just bewildered, just the straightforward fact of the thing. You've always had difficulty, he said quietly, accepting how things work in this family. Then he hung up. I sat at that kitchen table for a very long time without moving. Patricia came and sat beside me. She didn't say anything. She had the wisdom to understand that sometimes the most useful thing you can offer a person is simply your presence while they process an earthquake. I spent the next 2 months investigating in the way that a non-lawyer, non-accountant man investigates things: public records, property filings, county databases. I have always been good at methodical work. Mechanics are. You learn early that patience and attention will eventually reveal what's wrong, even when everything looks fine on the surface. What I found disturbed me deeply. The transfers were numerous. They were interlocking. Several of them involved shell entities that appeared to have been created specifically to receive assets that had originated in the family trust. The timeline was consistent. Many of the most significant movements had occurred in the year surrounding my mother's death, with an unusual cluster in the 6 months following it. I showed everything to Patricia. She sat with it for a long time. Then she asked the question that recalibrated everything. Daniel, do you think she knew this was coming? I stared at her. Your mother, Patricia said gently. She said the truth was going to matter. What if she wasn't just being philosophical? I thought about that for a very long time. Then I thought about those final weeks, the way she had looked at me with that careful, measured expression, the things she had said and hadn't said, the way she had held my hand. One day, the truth is going to matter, Daniel. She hadn't been preparing me for grief. She had been preparing me for something else entirely. I hired an attorney named Margaret Holloway. She ran a modest practice out of a converted house on the edge of town. Nothing flashy, nothing expensive. But the morning I walked into her office with 3 folders of documents and sat down across from her, she spent 45 minutes reviewing everything without saying a word. Then she set the folders down, took off her reading glasses, and said, Mr. Mercer, something here is very wrong. It was the first time any professional had said that out loud. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear it until the words were in the air. We filed suit. The response was immediate and multidirectional. Family members I had known my entire life stopped returning calls. Neighbors who had waved from driveways for decades suddenly seemed very busy whenever I appeared. People who had known me since childhood crossed to the other side of the grocery store aisle. A man I had worked on cars with for 15 years told me, sincerely and not unkindly, that I was making a mistake that was going to cost me everything. Your father has lawyers, he said. He has money. He has connections. Daniel, he'll grind you down until there's nothing left. Maybe, probably even. Nathan stopped speaking to me entirely. No call, no letter, no explanation, just absence, which, given our history, I suppose I should have expected. Nathan had always been the family's comfort zone. Disrupting the family's comfort was not something he was equipped to tolerate. Carol, my sister, expressed sympathy privately and said nothing publicly. I understood. She was far away and had her own life. I didn't blame her. I carried a small, steady hurt about it, but I didn't blame her. 3 weeks before trial, the news arrived that completed the picture of what I was actually walking into. My father had retained Charles Whitmore to personally lead his defense. Whitmore was not merely a good attorney. He was an institution. He had practiced law in this county for 38 years. His name was on the donor wall at the hospital. He sat on the board of the Historical Society. Judges had clerked for him before they became judges. He was the kind of man whose influence ran so deep and so wide that its full extent was simply not visible from where I stood. That night, Patricia and I sat in the kitchen after the children had gone to bed, and we were honest with each other. "It's not too late to settle," she said, not as a suggestion. As an option, she wanted me to have the freedom to chew. "See?" "I know," I said. "Is that what you want?" I thought about my mother's hand squeezing mine. "No," I said, "it's not." The courthouse was a building I had known my whole life. I had renewed my driver's license there. I had registered vehicles, paid taxes, stood in line for jury duty. But walking through those doors on the first morning of trial felt like passing through a border into a country with different laws. Everything was the same, and nothing was the same. The courtroom filled quickly. Small towns are reliable for this. Whatever else they lack, they rarely lack an audience. My father arrived with the assurance of a man who had never lost anything that wasn't already decided to be lost. He was 83 years old, and age had bent him slightly, the way wind bends an old tree without breaking it. He took his seat at the defense table and exchanged a few words with Whitmore, calm, almost jovial. Whitmore worked the room the way politicians work rooms. Handshakes for the clerks, a nod for the bailiff. A brief, collegial exchange with a court officer who clearly knew him well. I sat beside Margaret Holloway and tried to look like a man who believed in what he was doing. Whitmore's opening statement was a masterpiece of gentle misdirection. He painted me not as a victim of fraud, but as a man whose wounded feelings had curdled into litigation. A disappointed son. A family disagreement inflated by grief and resentment. He was careful to express sympathy for the difficulty of losing a mother. He was careful to praise my father's decades of work building the family business. He was careful never to say anything that could be characterized as cruel. The best lies, I've come to understand, are built around accurate facts arranged in a misleading order. Margaret's opening was quieter and more direct. She outlined the evidence, the dates, the entities, the transfers. She didn't perform, she presented. And I could see from the jury's faces that they were following, but that following was not the same as believing. Not yet. The first days of testimony were grueling. Former colleagues of my father praised his integrity. Business associates described him as a man of his word. A longtime employee talked about the company's culture with genuine warmth. None of them were lying, exactly. People can tell you true things that create a fundamentally false impression, and this is perhaps the most sophisticated form of deception there is. Nathan testified on the third day. Watching my brother sworn in was one of the stranger experiences of my life. We had grown up in the same house, eaten at the same table, argued about the same television programs. And here he was, sitting in that box, preparing to contradict everything I had spent months building. Whitmore guided him skillfully. Nathan confirmed that all transfers had been discussed, that all decisions had been legitimate, that all actions had been taken in the best interest of the family, meaning the portion of the family whose interests were considered worth protecting. He didn't look at me once during his testimony. When Margaret cross-examined him, small inconsistencies began appearing. He couldn't reliably explain certain dates. Certain amendments didn't match the timeline he had described. He couldn't account for why specific documents bore creation dates that predated events they were supposedly responding to. But inconsistency is not proof, and the defense team was very skilled at absorbing small hits without bleeding visibly. By the end of the first week, I had to be honest with myself. We were losing. Margaret called me into her office one evening after court. She made coffee. She sat across from me. She was quiet for a moment in the particular way that people are quiet when they're choosing the most humane way to say something difficult. "We need something stronger," she said. I already knew it. I had known it for days. "The jury is listening," she continued. "They're taking notes, but we're not putting enough solid ground under their feet. Without something more concrete, we're asking 12 strangers to make a very uncomfortable decision based on what amounts to circumstantial pattern building." "What do you need?" She looked at me steadily. something I don't currently have. I drove home in silence. The sealed archive was still missing. Margaret had filed motions weeks earlier requesting access to county court records connected to the matter. The courthouse staff was searching. But courthouse storage is a labyrinth of forgotten boxes and misfiled decades, and the urgency that I felt was not necessarily the urgency the system felt. Every day that passed felt like sand through a fist. On the second to last day of scheduled testimony, my father approached me during a lunch recess. We were alone in a hallway. He moved slowly, the way older men move when they want to appear unhurried. He stopped beside me and looked out a window for a moment without speaking. Then he smiled in a way I recognized from decades of living, in proximity to him. "Daniel," he said quietly, "you know how this ends." I said nothing. "You've always been too emotional about things." The voice was almost gentle. "That's been your problem your whole life." He patted my shoulder, the way you might pat the shoulder of a child who had made an understandable but ultimately futile effort. Then he walked away. I stood there for a long moment, looking at nothing. No witnesses. Those words ran through me like a cold current. That night, I didn't sleep. Patricia lay beside me in the dark, and I knew from her breathing that she wasn't sleeping either. We had the quiet, exhausted understanding of people who have come too far to stop, but aren't certain they're going to make it through. The following morning was scheduled to be the final day of testimony. Closing arguments would follow, then deliberations, then judgment. I arrived at the courthouse that morning feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not fear exactly. More like the particular clarity that comes to a person who has decided that regardless of outcome, they are not going to be ashamed of what they did. I had fought for the truth. I had done it honestly, with a small-town lawyer and a stack of public records and a conviction that my mother's final words to me meant something. Whatever happened today, that was true. I sat down. I waited. The final witnesses testified. The defense rested. Our side rested. By mid-morning, the evidence phase was over. The atmosphere in the room had shifted into the particular stillness that precedes a verdict. People were mentally preparing for closing arguments. The outcome seemed, to most observers, already written. Then the side door opened. A court clerk entered quietly through the side entrance. Nobody paid particular attention. Clerks move in and out of courtrooms constantly. It's part of the ambient motion of the place. But this clerk was carrying something. An old archive box. Brown cardboard, worn at the corners, with faded labels and the general appearance of something that had been waiting in a room without windows for a very long time. The clerk carried it to the judge's bench and placed it there. The judge looked at it. His expression shifted in a way that was small enough to miss if you weren't watching closely. I was watching closely. I had been watching that man's face for days. He motioned the clerk closer. A brief, quiet exchange that the rest of the room couldn't hear. The judge looked at the box again. Across the courtroom, Charles Whitmore's posture changed by approximately 3 degrees. Nobody else would have noticed. I noticed. The judge called both attorneys to the bench. Margaret stood. Whitmore stood. They converged in a huddle that lasted several minutes while the rest of us sat in helpless, suspended animation. Margaret returned to our table. Her face was carefully neutral, but her eyes were doing something I hadn't seen them do before. "There are archived materials in that box," she said quietly. "The court is going to review them before we proceed." I kept my voice even. "What kind of materials?" She looked at me. "We're about to find out." The judge addressed the courtroom. His voice was measured, entirely routine. "Before we move to closing arguments, the court has received archived materials submitted as potentially relevant to these proceedings. A brief recess is warranted for review." The defense objected. Whitmore was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, the timing of this submission is highly irregular. The evidence phase has concluded. The defense respectfully objects to." The judge raised one hand. "The objection is noted, Mr. Whitmore." He looked at the box. "The court will review the materials." Whitmore sat down slowly. I watched his face as he did it. In 38 years of distinguished practice, Charles Whitmore had likely never been told to sit down in a tone that suggested the sitting down was not entirely optional. The adjustment was small and immediate, and visible only if you were looking for it. I was looking for it. The judge opened the archive box carefully. He worked through several folders of what appeared to be standard documents. His face remained composed, methodical. Then he reached the bottom of the box and his hands paused. He removed a sealed envelope. Old paper, the particular amber yellow of documents that have spent decades in a dry room. It bore court identification stamps, a filing date, and a notation indicating sealed status under a protective order. The date on the order was 23 years ago. The room was so quiet I could hear the fluorescent lights. The judge examined the seal for a moment. He opened it with care that bordered on deliberateness. He removed the contents. Several pages, typed, notarized, official. He began reading. 1 page. 2 pages. His expression gave away nothing. 3 pages. At the top of the 4th page. He stopped. His eyes stayed on a single paragraph for what felt like a very long time. 5 seconds, 10, 15. He read it again. Then he set his glasses down on the bench with a small, quiet sound that carried to every corner of the room. And he said it. Not loudly, not dramatically, if anything the opposite. My God. The words were barely audible, but everyone heard them. Because when a judge who has spent 31 years on the bench whispers those words over a document, the human nervous system responds to it before the conscious mind catches up. I saw it move through the room like a wave. People went very still. My father's attorney went the color of old snow. My father stopped smiling. The judge sat without moving for a moment longer. Then he looked up. Not at me, not at my father. At Charles Whitmore. The look lasted for several seconds. Something passed between them that I couldn't entirely read. Then the judge looked back at the document. He continued reading. After several more minutes of silence, he set the papers on the bench. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled in the way that you control a thing you would otherwise be unable to control. Mr. Whitmore. The attorney rose. Yes, Your Honor. Did you personally supervise the trust amendment dated March 19, 2003? A pause. Yes. And you certified the legal standing of that amendment? At the time, yes. And the property conveyances, filed in the calendar year following? Whitmore's jaw moved slightly. Yes, Your Honor. The judge nodded, slowly, in the way that contains something other than simple acknowledgement. Interesting. The word fell into the room and just sat there. The judge picked up another page. He studied it. Then he said the thing that nobody in that courtroom was prepared for. This sealed filing contains sworn and notarized testimony from Alina Mercer, submitted under court protection, and filed with instructions that it be preserved and produced in the event of any legal proceeding involving the Mercer family trust. The room stirred. The judge raised a hand and the room went still. The filing further contains supporting documentation including correspondence, financial records, and certified appraisals. He turned a page. And it contains written evidence indicating that at least one subsequent filing directly contradicted records that were legally protected under the terms of this court's own order. The silence was absolute. My father leaned forward in his chair. Something was moving behind his eyes that I had never seen there before. He turned to look at Whitmore. Whitmore did not turn back. The judge's voice, still controlled, said, It further indicates that the individual who prepared those subsequent filings had prior knowledge that they were in contradiction to protected documents. Whitmore's hands, resting on the defense table, went very still. My father stared at the side of his attorney's face. And then the judge did something that no one present will ever forget. He looked toward the back of the room. Bailiffs. The officer stepped forward. The judge's eyes returned to Whitmore. "Lock the doors." For a moment, nothing happened. The instruction was so unexpected that the room simply failed to process it. Then the bailiff moved. The heavy courtroom doors swung closed. The locks engaged with a sound that was not especially loud, but that somehow filled every cubic foot of the space. Gasps erupted from the gallery. My father half rose from his chair. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice cracked at the edges. The judge did not look at him. Whitmore sat with his hands flat on the table. He had the expression of a man who had spent 38 years practicing for every possible contingency and had just encountered one he hadn't included in the preparation. Court officers moved through the room with the particular quiet efficiency of people who had been briefed. Additional officials appeared through the side entrance. The atmosphere transformed from a civil proceeding into something else entirely, something more serious, more irreversible, something with a different weight to it. Margaret leaned toward me. "Daniel," her voice was barely above a breath. I looked at her. "Your mother," she said. I couldn't answer. I was looking at the judge, who was looking at the sealed documents that my mother had placed under court protection 23 years ago, apparently anticipating a day very much like this one. The recess that followed lasted several hours. County investigators arrived. Legal officials convened behind closed doors. The gallery sat in stunned near silence, occasionally breaking into whispered conversation that would subside every time a court officer glanced in their direction. I sat with Margaret and we spoke very little. There was not much to say. The situation was saying everything. Nathan was recalled to testify. Watching my brother walk back to the witness stand, he looked like a man W. Ho had aged 10 years in a single afternoon. His earlier confidence was gone. The careful, coached steadiness he had maintained through days of testimony had dissolved. When confronted with specific documents from the sealed filing, documents that directly contradicted the timeline he had presented under oath, Nathan's composure broke in a way that was quiet and painful to watch. He looked at the floor. "I knew some of the documents didn't look right," he said. The courtroom was absolutely still. I didn't ask questions. His voice was barely audible. I didn't want to know. It was perhaps the most honest thing my brother had said in that room. The admission didn't excuse the participation, but it complicated the picture in a way I hadn't expected. Because Nathan wasn't a mastermind. He was a man who had spent his entire life choosing comfort over confrontation and had eventually found himself standing at the edge of something he hadn't fully understood he was walking toward. Life is rarely clean enough to give you clean villains. That's one of the things I've had to make my peace with. The full picture that emerged over the following days was not what I had imagined when I filed suit. It was larger and in some ways stranger. My mother, Eleanor, had gone to see a retired judge named Harold Pryor approximately 25 years ago. She hadn't gone because of any specific crisis. She had gone because she was a woman who paid close attention to things, and she had noticed patterns in the management of family assets that concerned her deeply. She didn't have proof of wrongdoing. She had something more preliminary than proof, a sustained, careful worry that things were not as they were being represented. Pryor, who had spent decades on the bench and recognized the texture of her concern, had guided her through a process. She had assembled the documentation she did have. She had made sworn statements about what she had observed. She had obtained certified copies of records she feared might be vulnerable to alteration. And she had filed all of it under court protection, sealed, preserved, with standing instructions that it be produced in any future legal proceeding involving the family trust. Then she had said nothing to anyone. She had put a judge's name on a slip of paper. She had tucked the paper inside an old cookbook. She had written her son's name on the envelope. And she had waited. The documents she had preserved revealed, among other things, a paper trail that directly undermined the legality of several subsequent filings prepared by Charles Whitmore. The correspondence in the file included written communication establishing that Whitmore had been made aware of the protected records at the time he prepared those filings. The language in that correspondence was, according to investigators, difficult to interpret as anything other than deliberate. The most powerful attorney in the county had filed documents he knew to be in contradiction with records bearing court protection. Whether my father had fully understood what he was authorizing was a question that investigators and subsequent proceedings would spend considerable time examining. What emerged, eventually, was a picture of a man who had trusted his attorney absolutely, and an attorney who had used that trust to construct a structure that served certain interests while concealing others. None of this cleared my father. He had signed documents. He had made decisions. He had chosen, at minimum, not to ask questions whose answers might have made certain conveniences unavailable. But it complicated the story. I have had to sit with that complication for a long time. By the end of that week, the State Bar's disciplinary board had been notified. Investigators had opened a formal file. Whitmore left the courthouse through a side entrance accompanied by officials. No cameras, no audience, just the quiet, permanent unraveling of a reputation built over nearly 4 decades. The court's ruling on the trust, when it came several weeks later, invalidated multiple transfers and restored the protected assets to their legally prescribed distribution. Additional proceedings would follow. Legal processes move slowly, and this one had many rooms to move through, but the central outcome was clear enough. My mother had been right. The truth had mattered. I sat in my truck outside the courthouse after the ruling was issued. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I sat and I thought about a woman who had spent her final years watching something go wrong and had found the only means available to her to leave a record of it. Who had folded a piece of paper inside a cookbook and addressed it to her oldest son because she believed, perhaps without fully articulating it to herself, that he was the one who would eventually go looking. After a while, Patricia called. I answered. "How are you?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. "Tired," I said, "and something else I do. And have a word for yet." She understood. She always understood. The months that followed were not triumphant in the way I had imagined triumph when I had imagined it at all. People who had avoided me began approaching me again. Some offered genuine apologies. Some offered the vaguer kind of apology that is really a request for social normalization. I tried not to be bitter about the distinction. Bitterness is a way of handing someone else continued power over your emotional life, and I had spent enough of my life in someone else's definition of my worth. Nathan called on a Tuesday afternoon in December. I saw his name on the screen and held the phone for a moment before answering. When I picked up, neither of us spoke immediately. The silence had a texture to it that was different from hostility. It was the silence of 2 men who had taken a very long road to a place where an honest conversation was finally possible. "I'm sorry, Daniel," he said. His voice sounded scraped clean. I didn't respond immediately. I spent a long time convincing myself that going along wasn't the same as doing something wrong. He stopped. I was wrong about that. "Yes," I said, "you were." Another silence. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. I thought about it. Probably, eventually, we'll figure it out. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a door left open rather than closed, and that felt like enough for December. Carol called the following month. We talked for nearly 2 hours, not about the lawsuit, not about the legal proceedings, not about who had done what and when. We talked about our mother, about her garden, about her laugh, about the way she would put food in front of a person before they knew they were hungry. It was the best conversation I'd had in years. My father asked to see me in February. The request came through Carol. He wasn't well. The combination of age and the events of the past year had done visible work on him. The confidence that had defined him for 83 years had been replaced by something more honest, if less comfortable. I almost said no. I won't pretend otherwise. The wounds were still there. The decades of measurement, of being found insufficient by a person whose job was not to find me insufficient but to love me. You don't get over that cleanly. You don't wake up one day and find that the accumulated weight of a childhood spent earning something you should have simply been given has evaporated. But Patricia said something to me the evening before I drove over. She said it quietly, the way she says important things. You've spent your whole life wanting him to see you, Daniel. Maybe now he does. The house was the same house I had grown up in. It looked smaller than I remembered, which is what houses do when you've spent enough years in the world beyond them. My father was sitting by the living room window when I came in. He looked like what he was, an old man at the end of something. The physical architecture of authority that had shaped my entire childhood had softened. He seemed, for the first time in my life, like a person rather than a force. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry." 3 words. Quiet, direct, unadorned by the elaborate scaffolding of justification that I had braced myself to hear. I waited. I told myself I was protecting the family, he said. Building something, making decisions that needed to be made. He shook his head, not as performance, just as a fact. I was protecting my need to be the one who decided things. That's different. The room was very still. I was harder on you than I should have been, he said. You were never the problem, you were the one most like her. A pause. I think that scared me. I didn't know what to do with that for a moment. We talked for a long time. An hour, maybe more. It was not an easy conversation, and it was not a conversation that resolved everything. Some damage doesn't get resolved. It gets carried more lightly or it doesn't, and you make what peace you can with the carrying. But something happened in that room. The pretending stopped. The performance, the architecture of a family that looked one way and functioned another, stopped. 2 people in a room together, telling the truth to each other for perhaps the first time. That was something. In the spring, our family gathered at my mother's grave for the first time since her burial. All of us. Nathan, Carol, some of the grandchildren, my father moving carefully with a cane, Patricia beside me. The cemetery was quiet. The trees were just beginning to green. Nobody made a speech. Nobody needed to. After the others began making their way back to their cars, I stayed behind for a few minutes. I took out the note, the one from the envelope inside the cookbook. I had carried it in my wallet since the day I found it, slightly worn at the folds now, the handwriting as clear and steady as ever. If you are reading this, I am gone. There are things I could never prove while I was alive. If you ever need answers, contact Judge Harold Pryor. Trust him. Love always, Mom. I read it one more time. Then I folded it carefully and put it back. I stood there for a little while, in the green quiet of that morning. My mother had known something important that took me a long time to understand. She had known that the most dangerous thing wasn't the dishonesty itself. It was the possibility that the dishonesty would simply continue, generation after generation, becoming the family's foundation rather than its wound. And she had done the only thing she could do, the quiet, careful, unglamorous work of preserving truth in a place where it couldn't be reached or altered or destroyed. She hadn't been able to make things right while she was alive. But she had made it possible for things to become right. That was her gift. Not money, not property, not the legal outcome of a trust dispute. A mother's stubborn, patient insistence that truth matters, that it should be recorded, that it should survive. I've thought a great deal about what I would want people to take from this story, if anything. I suppose it comes down to this. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It doesn't look like bravery in battle or boldness in public. It looks like a woman writing a note by herself and tucking it inside a cookbook. It looks like a son driving to a small law office with a stack of public records and a feeling he couldn't entirely justify. It looks like showing up, again and again, to something that most people around you have decided is a lost cause. It looks like believing that truth matters, even when nobody else seems to think so. And it looks like being willing to sit across from the people who hurt you, after the truth has finally come out, and asking what comes next. Not because what they did was acceptable, but because the alternative is carrying it forever, and you've already been carrying enough. Justice isn't the ending. Justice is what makes it possible for the ending to begin. The rest is up to us. There is one more thing I want to tell you. Several months after everything concluded, I went back to see Judge Harold Pryor. He was retired, living on a quiet road outside of town, spending his afternoons on the porch the way he had been doing when I first visited him. He was older than I remembered, more tired, but the steadiness in him, the particular quality that my mother had apparently recognized and trusted, was still there. I brought him a copy of the court ruling. I thought he would want to see it. He read it slowly, the way he seemed to read everything. Then he set it on the table between us, and he looked at the trees in the yard for a moment. "She was very specific," he said. "I know." She knew exactly what she was worried about, she just didn't know when it would become relevant. He paused, or whether it ever would. "I thought about that. She never told me any of it, not explicitly." He looked at me. "She told you enough." I thought about the hospital room, her hand in mine, the maple tree in the backyard, the question she had answered with a smile and a change of subject. "She trusted you," Pryor said. "That's what she was really leaving you, not evidence, trust." I drove home that evening on a road I have driven 10,000 times. The fields on either side were turning towards summer. The light was the particular warm gold of early evening in Ohio, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look briefly significant. I thought about what it means to be trusted by someone. Not the conditional trust that comes with performance, not the trust you earn by being useful or agreeable or willing to look away from uncomfortable things. The deep kind, the kind that says, "I believe in who you are. I believe you will do the right thing when the moment requires it. I believe you are capable of carrying something important and not putting it down." My mother had carried her knowledge for decades without the resources to act on it, and when she ran out of time, she had transferred the carrying to me. I had not put it down. I want to believe that she knew I wouldn't. Patricia was in the kitchen when I got home. She was making something that smelled like the meal she makes on evenings when she senses that a person needs comfort more than they need calories. She looked up when I came in, and she read something in my face. "How was it?" she asked. I thought about how to answer. "Good," I finally said. "I think it was good." She nodded and went back to what she was doing. And I sat at the kitchen table, in the house we had built together across 35 years of honest life, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel when all of this began. Peace. Not the peace of having won. Not the peace of having been proven right, though I had been. Not the peace of seeing wrongdoing exposed, though it had been. A different kind of Ace, the kind that settles into a person when they look at their life and recognize that the things that actually mattered, they did right. The things that could not be controlled, the family dynamics, the years of being measured and found wanting, the people who chose distance over difficulty, those things had happened and they had left marks, and they would always have left marks. But they had not defined the outcome. I had. My mother had. The truth had. That's the thing about truth, I've come to understand. It doesn't have a time limit. It doesn't expire when the person who knew it dies. It doesn't dissolve when the people who benefited from its concealment are powerful enough to make ignoring it seem like the sensible option. Truth has a particular patience that most people underestimate. It will wait in an old archive box in a county courthouse for 23 years if that's what's required. It will sit in a sealed envelope until the moment is right. It will fold itself into a cookbook and wait for the afternoon when a man cleaning out a garage is finally ready to find it. All you have to do is preserve it. All you have to do is trust that one day it will matter. My mother knew that. And in the end, she was right about everything. If this story reminded you of someone who trusted you with something important, or a truth you've been carrying alone, or a fight you've been afraid wasn't worth continuing, I hope it gave you something useful. Sometimes the stories that find us are the ones we needed without knowing it. Thank you for being here.